In the hollow hours before dawn, when the pills had worn off but sleep still wouldn't come, Johnny Cash would sit in his empty kitchen and wonder if the man in black had finally consumed the man underneath. The world knew him as the voice of the forgotten, the champion of prisoners and outcasts, the man who sang about love and loss with a conviction that made grown men weep. But what they didn't see were the nights when he couldn't recognize his own face in the mirror, when the darkness he sang about had moved inside him and made itself at home. They called him a legend, an icon, the man in black. But in those silent moments when the applause had faded and the crowds had gone home to their ordinary lives, he was just J.R. Cash from Arkansas, a farmer's son who had learned too late that fame was just another kind of prison, and the keys belonged to demons he had invited in himself. John R. Cash was born in 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas, into a world where cotton was king and poverty was the only certainty most folks could count on. His father, Ray, worked the land with hands that never quite healed from the day's labor, while his mother, Carrie, tried to hold their family together with love and determination and the kind of quiet strength that doesn't get written about in history books. The Cash family lived in a company house provided by the New Deal administration, a small structure that housed 7 children and 2 parents. J.R. learned early that wanting something and getting it were 2 different things. But Carrie filled their home with music anyway. She would sing while she cooked, while she cleaned, carrying melodies that had been passed down through generations of people who had little else to pass on except songs and stories. The Depression years taught young J.R. that life was something that happened to you, not something you controlled. He watched his father struggle against forces bigger than any one man: drought, debt, the simple mathematics of trying to feed 7 children on land that barely yielded enough to survive. Ray Cash wasn't a man given to displays of emotion, but J.R. would sometimes catch him staring out at the fields with an expression that looked like defeat wearing overalls. But it was the death of his brother Jack that taught him the hardest lesson of all: that the people you love most can disappear without warning, leaving holes in your heart that never quite heal. Jack was the good son, the one destined for the ministry, the boy who read his Bible every night and believed that goodness was rewarded and evil was punished. He was 2 years older than J.R., but in many ways he seemed decades older, serious, thoughtful, possessed of a moral certainty that his younger brother both admired and envied. On the morning that changed everything, Jack left for his job at the mill, while J.R. went fishing. They had argued about it the night before, Jack saying J.R. should come to work with him, J.R. insisting that the fish were biting and work could wait. The last words they exchanged weren't angry, but they weren't loving either, just the casual dismissal that passes between brothers who assume they'll have a lifetime to make up for small unkindnesses. When the table saw cut through him at the mill where he worked to help support the family, Jack lingered for 8 days in agony that no 14-year-old should have to endure. J.R. sat by his bedside watching his brother's life leak away, despite everyone's prayers, despite the doctor's efforts, despite the desperate bargains J.R. made with God in the secret chambers of his heart. Jack's last words were about seeing angels, about going to a better place, about not being afraid. But J.R. was afraid that he should have been at the mill instead of at the fishing hole, afraid that God had taken the wrong brother, afraid that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the life that Jack had lost. The air force took him away from Arkansas and showed him a bigger world, but it also introduced him to pills, little white companions that could make the loneliness bearable, that could quiet the voices in his head that whispered he wasn't good enough, that he should have been the one who died instead of Jack. When he came home from the service, he married Vivian and tried to build a normal life in Memphis, selling appliances door to door and dreaming of something he couldn't quite name. But normal had never fit him properly, like a suit tailored for someone else's body. The dreams were too big, the dissatisfaction too deep, the pills too necessary for getting through days that stretched like prison sentences. Sam Phillips and Son Records changed everything, but not in ways that J.R. had expected. Success, when it finally came, felt less like victory and more like stepping into quicksand. The more you struggled, the deeper you sank. The recording contract led to touring. Touring led to more pills, More pills led to the slow dissolution of everything he thought he wanted. The early years of fame were intoxicating in all the wrong ways. Crowds screaming his name, radio stations playing his songs, money coming in faster than he had ever imagined possible. But success in the music business meant being away from home more nights than he was there. Meant living in hotel rooms that all looked the same. Meant trying to be Johnny Cash every moment of every day, when some days he could barely remember who JR had been. Vivian tried to hold their marriage together. But how do you compete with an audience that loves your husband more than he loves himself? She would watch him leave for another tour, another recording session, another commitment that seemed more important than the family he was supposed to come home to. And Johnny would leave, not because he loved her less, but because staying meant facing the man he was becoming when he wasn't performing. The pills, multiplied like secrets. What started as energy to get through long days became energy to get through short nights, became the only way to feel normal, became the only way to feel anything at all. Amphetamines to wake up, barbiturates to calm down, alcohol to numb the space in between. Each substance promised to solve the problems that the others had created. But promises made by pills are like promises made by liars. They always require more than they deliver. The first pills came from a doctor, prescribed for exhaustion after a grueling tour. They were small and white and innocent-looking, and they made him feel like he could handle anything. But innocence is the first casualty of addiction. And before long, Johnny was seeking out doctors who asked fewer questions. By the early 60s, his pill consumption had escalated beyond anything medical. He would take handfuls at a time, chasing a feeling that stayed further and further ahead of him. His hands would shake when he couldn't get them. His vision would blur when he took too many. But facing reality without chemical assistance seemed impossible. The pills changed everything about him. They made him paranoid, convinced that people were plotting against him, that his phone was tapped, that even his closest friends couldn't be trusted. They made him angry over small things and indifferent to large ones. They made him forget conversations he'd had hours earlier and remember slights from years past with vivid, burning clarity. By the early 60s, Johnny Cash was disappearing inside the character he played on stage. The black clothes that had started as a statement became a uniform he couldn't take off. The deep voice that had won him fame became the only voice he could trust. The songs about pain and redemption became the only truths he could speak, because speaking the truth about his own pain and his own need for redemption was too terrifying to contemplate. The paradox of his addiction was that the same pills that were destroying his life were also, in some twisted way, making his music more authentic. The pain he sang about was real now, even if it was self-inflicted. The darkness he explored in his songs had taken up residence in his soul. He wasn't performing desperation anymore, he was living it. But authenticity achieved through self-destruction is a fool's bargain. The pills might have given depth to his music, but they robbed him of everything else. His health, his relationships, his ability to be present for the people who loved him. He became a stranger to his own children, a disappointment to his parents, a cautionary tale whispered about in Nashville's industry circles. The arrests started as accidents and became a pattern. Pills found in his luggage, public intoxication, disturbing the peace. Each incident another headline, another embarrassment, another piece of evidence that Johnny Cash was not the man his songs claimed him to be. But even the humiliation couldn't stop him, because stopping meant facing the silence in his own head, and the silence was worse than the shame. June Carter came into his life like sunlight through a window that had been boarded up for years. She was married, he was married, neither of them was looking for love, but sometimes love doesn't wait for convenient circumstances. June saw past the pills and the anger and the self-destruction to the man underneath, the one who still grieved for his brother, who still felt like he didn't deserve the love he inspired in others. Their relationship began as a professional collaboration, two voices that harmonized in ways that seemed effortless but were actually the result of deep musical understanding. When they sang together, something happened that was bigger than either of them individually, a kind of alchemy that turned two wounded people into something beautiful and whole. But the love that developed between them was complicated by guilt, by existing marriages, by the knowledge that they were hurting innocent people. June's husband didn't deserve betrayal. Vivian had endured years of Johnny's addiction and absence, yet they couldn't stay away from each other. Between shows, they would find excuses to be alone together, rehearsing songs that didn't need rehearsal, having conversations that lasted until dawn, sharing the kind of intimacy that has nothing to do with physical touch and everything to do with being truly seen by another person. June understood addiction in ways that Vivian never could, having grown up in a family where music and pills often went hand in hand, where talented people self-medicated against the pressures of performing and the loneliness of fame. She didn't judge Johnny for his weakness. She recognized it as the flip side of the sensitivity that made his music so powerful. But loving June meant admitting that he was capable of breaking his marriage vows, of hurting people who had never done anything to deserve his betrayal. It meant acknowledging that he had become the kind of man he had once looked down upon, selfish, destructive, willing to sacrifice others' happiness for his own desires. The affair nearly destroyed them both. The guilt ate at June until she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at herself in the mirror without seeing a woman who had betrayed her own values. Johnny's pill consumption increased as he tried to numb the shame of what he was doing while being unable to stop doing it. When they finally married in 1968, after both had divorced their respective spouses, it should have been a happy ending. But beginnings built on endings are always precarious. They had to live with the knowledge of how their love had hurt other people, had to build their happiness on a foundation that included other people's pain. The divorce from Vivian was brutal in its finality. She had endured years of his absences, his addiction, his emotional unavailability, hoping that love would be enough to bring him back to himself. But some kinds of damage can't be undone with good intentions, and some kinds of love aren't strong enough to overcome the person's unwillingness to be saved. The pills continued to rule his life even after he married June. She tried everything, hiding them, flushing them, begging him to choose between the drugs and their relationship. But addiction doesn't respond to ultimatums, and addicts don't stop using because they love someone. They stop when the pain of using becomes greater than the pain of stopping, and Johnny wasn't there yet. The lowest point came in the late 60s when he was taking up to 100 pills a day just to maintain what he thought was normal function. He would perform concerts without remembering them afterward, would have conversations that existed only in his drug-addled mind, would lose days and weeks to blackouts that erased time like a pencil eraser removing pencil marks. That there were nights when he would wake up in strange places, parking lots, fields, other people's houses, with no memory of how he had gotten there. There were mornings when he would find pills scattered on his bathroom floor like confetti from a party he couldn't remember attending. There were afternoons when June would look at him with the expression of someone watching a drowning man who kept pushing away the life preserver. The cave in Nickajack Cave was supposed to be the end of everything. Crawling into that darkness with only enough flashlight battery to get lost, Johnny thought he was finally going to find the peace that had eluded him since Jack died. The cave was supposed to be his tomb, his final escape from the man he had become and couldn't figure out how to stop being. He had driven there in a haze of pills and despair, leaving behind a note that said goodbye without explaining why. The cave system near Chattanooga was vast and unmapped in places, full of passages that led nowhere and chambers that had never seen daylight. It seemed like the perfect place for a man to disappear, to become just another story that people would tell about the dangers of fame and drugs and loving someone too much to let them watch you destroy yourself. The descent into the cave was like descending into his own mind, dark, confusing, full of dead ends. He crawled deeper, following the beam of his flashlight until it began to dim. In the complete darkness, he felt a strange peace. But even in the depths of that cave, when the flashlight died and the darkness was complete, something in him refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness inherited from his father. Maybe it was fear of what came after death. Maybe it was the voice of his mother singing hymns in the kitchen of their company house in Arkansas. Whatever it was, it made him turn around and start crawling back toward what he hoped was life. The journey out was harder than the journey in. Without light, he had to feel his way, along the cave walls, following air currents. His knees bled from crawling over rocks, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying. When he finally emerged into sunlight hours later, covered in mud and blood and his own shame, he looked like a man who had been to hell and decided it wasn't for him after all. June found him there, sitting outside the cave entrance, too exhausted to drive home, too grateful to be alive to care about anything else. The cave experience didn't cure him instantly. Addiction doesn't work that way, and neither does redemption. But it showed him that somewhere inside him was a man who wanted to live, even if that man had been buried under years of pills and poor decisions and the kind of self-loathing that makes destruction feel like the only honest choice. The recovery that followed wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no moment of revelation, no spiritual awakening that magically cured years of self-destruction. There were just days of choosing not to take the pills, of learning how to feel emotions without chemical buffers, of remembering what it was like to wake up and know where you were and how you had gotten there. June stood by him through the worst of it, the shaking, the sweating, the nights when he was convinced that sobriety was worse than addiction, because at least when he was high, he didn't have to think about all the people he had hurt and all the time he had wasted. She held him when he cried for his brother, for his first marriage, for the years he couldn't get back. The comeback albums of the 70s reflected a man who had looked into his own darkness and found a way back to the light. But the light wasn't pure or simple. It was complicated by knowledge, shadowed by experience, made more precious by how close he had come to losing it forever. The later years brought new challenges. His voice deepened and roughened, scarred by years of abuse and age, but somehow more honest than it had ever been. His hands shook sometimes, a legacy of the pills and the damage they had done to his nervous system. But they still found their way around a guitar with the muscle memory of a man who had been playing since childhood. The young musicians who came to him for advice saw a legend, but Johnny saw himself more clearly now, as a man who had been given extraordinary gifts and had nearly thrown them away, who had hurt people who loved him and had somehow been forgiven, who had found redemption, not through perfection, but through the willingness to keep trying, despite repeated failures. He never stopped grieving for Jack, never stopped wondering what his life might have been if his brother had lived, if addiction had never taken hold, if he had been stronger or smarter or better at managing the weight of his own emotions. But he learned to live with the questions, to make peace with the fact that some wounds never fully heal but can be transformed into something useful, songs that help other people feel less alone in their own darkness. The Man in Black was never really about the clothes. It was about standing with the forgotten, about remembering that success doesn't erase the pain of your past or the pain of others, about using whatever platform you have been given to speak for those who don't have a voice. The dark years had taught him that he belonged with the outcasts and the addicts and the broken-hearted, not because he was better than them, but because he was one of them. In his final years, when the pills were mostly a memory and the worst of the self-destruction was behind him, Johnny Cash could sit in his kitchen at dawn and recognize the man looking back at him from the reflection in his coffee cup. It wasn't the man he had dreamed of becoming when he was young and thought fame would solve all his problems. But it was a man he could live with, a man who had earned his peace through suffering and his wisdom through mistakes. The darkness never fully went away. It lived in him like an old injury that ached when the weather changed. But he had learned to make friends with it, to understand that the same depth of feeling that made him capable of self-destruction also made him capable of creating beauty, of touching other people's hearts, of transforming pain into something that could heal. The dark years of Johnny Cash were not a detour from his story. They were the story, the crucible that forged everything meaningful that came after. Without them, he might have been just another talented singer. With them, he became something rarer, a man who had looked into his own abyss and found a way to climb back out, bringing songs with him that lit the way for others who were still lost in their own darkness.